It says God does not show favoritism. This, like, what's that adage that you should never make an ultimate statement like this, a declarative statement with zero exceptions, because it's always going to have exceptions
it
to
can
it.
Be dangerous.
Yeah. So anyway, this verse just seems like, primed for me to nitpick. God does not show favoritism. To me, this seems obviously false. If you look at the biblical narrative, of course, we've talked about this a bunch of times, that God seemed to favor Israel above all the other nations. They're the protagonist of the Old Testament, and then basically everyone else is the enemy. He also anoints specific people to do his work, to be prophets or kings, or to be like the one family on earth that is not destroyed in a global flood, for example. We're going to get to Romans 9 and Calvinism and God saying, Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated, or Paul saying that about God, rather. So that's probably a can of worms we can probably explore further in future weeks. And even Jesus, even the person of Jesus, according to the Gospels, had his inner circle, and he had the disciple that he loved. So again, like, I just feel like this verse, God does not show favoritism, is just asking to be criticized here. So here's my question. Why doesn't God just admit that he plays favorites?
I got to tell you, when I read this question this week, I literally laughed out loud because you explained, where you were going with it. And I thought, you're absolutely right. Like, just on an immediate surface level reading, you can quickly, if you know the Bible at all, you can quickly think of, well, what about, and you brought up a few good ones. Like, well, what about this, And so it does make me laugh. And this is where I think, this is why this conversation is good, Jeff, because you are bringing in to the conversation what, I think is a healthy skepticism of, whoa, if this means this, what about this? And, you're using the text to, bear light on the text, which I think is great. And so I applaud that. That's good. This is why, if you're a Christian listening to this and you live in Christian circles and you go to the same church with the same people every weekend, you can easily start to believe everyone sees God and faith in the Bible the way you do. And that's why these kind of conversations are helpful, because you sit with someone else and go, oh yeah, I mean, that's a little problematic. So hats off to you. This was a good poke.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Just people talk about the Bible. It doesn't make sense. How could a man live inside of a whale? How could there be a global flood? Blah, blah, blah. But I'm like, okay, whatever. Just make it internally make sense. Make the internal logic.
Just agree with yourself on the verses.
Yeah, agree with yourself. Exactly. Make it make sense, Jeremy.
Okay, I'm going to try, Jeff.
Okay.
I'm going to do my best here. Did a little digging on this. Found some fun facts for you. Did you know that the word translated as favoritism has so far only been found in Christian writers? It does not occur before the New Testament, which means the word Paul is using here is apparently a Christian word made up by Christians. So we obviously have an English translation that, we've translated as favoritism. But the actual word he's using is a word that Christians invented, as far as we can tell, which I just think is kind of an interesting, historical way to understand this text. Paul's addressing a concept that either Paul created or the New Testament writers. There's nothing before this, and then really we've only seen it translated from Christian authors. Now, in the context of Romans 2, so the verses preceding what he just said, they're all about injustice. And, that's the context of what Paul's talking about. And then he brings this idea of favoritism. And I studied a little bit this week of where else does this idea get brought up? And all the other examples that I found were all in the context of injustice. So my answer is going to start with, I think maybe favoritism is not the perfect English word to describe the concept Paul's describing here. Because I would agree with you, favoritism doesn't work. It falls apart. that statement doesn't hold to be true if we understand it with the translation of favoritism. So I want to agree with you there, and then posit a new theory of, can we create space for something else, given the fact that this is an apparently original word to the New Testament writers. So maybe there's some other definition of what Paul's trying to get at, and we kind of landed on favoritism and called it a day and didn't realize that doesn't really work. Now, I would say a few things. Yes, God absolutely, according to like a literal definition of favoritism, God absolutely plays favorites. And I would say this because of the text, and you referenced this. But, one of the themes we talk about this, one of the themes throughout the Bible is that God would pick people to bless in hopes that they would bless others. Now, that is a version of favoritism, but ultimately I would say it's not favoritism the way we often think about it. So favoritism we think about is usually in a negative sense where, I have 5 kids. If I were to play favorites with my kids, that would, you would think of, oh, he's picked one kid over the other kids. That is not okay. That's, we would say that's bad parenting.
Like if you got a really nice coat for just one of your kids, those really colorful.
Stop quoting the Bible, Jeff. Gosh, I'm trying to answer your theology questions. You just keep bringing more verses in.
Sorry.
That's hilarious. Yes. Well done. Hat tip to you. Well done. So that, again, that's favoritism. And that story doesn't end well because of that favoritism. And, the brothers resent him. That's what happens when you have favoritism, which is why
right.
This is not, I don't think, the right word to use, because favoritism creates that kind of animosity. And you keep illustrating it. There's tons of examples of that. But if you look at why did God bless Israel and, beginning with Abraham, what was the intent there? It wasn't to exclude the other people in the world. It was God's method of showing his blessing to all the world. And that would be like me saying, I'm going to look at my oldest son who's 14 and he can drive soon. I'm already thinking about that because we need help on the driving front. So I'm like, all right, in like a year and a half, you can, start helping drive, and then you get your license. It's going to be awesome. And I'm going to, let you have access to a vehicle that no other kid has. But the purpose of that is you're going to help us, drive your siblings around. So in one sense, you could look at that and go, well, you're showing favorites. You're letting one of your kids drive and you're not letting all your kids drive, right? You're like, oh yeah, like one kid has access because of the specifics of what that kid has. Like he's older and, he's able to drive. But ultimately, the point is I would want all of my kids to be equally blessed and equally experience that. And so I would suggest that when we think about favoritism with God, we think about it more in a holistic, what do we actually see in the big picture, not just in moment by moment where you'd say, well, yeah, they certainly got something that others didn't get. Because Peter, James, and John were the 3 inner circles that, the inner part of Jesus' circle that you mentioned. But it wasn't to say Jesus didn't value or appreciate the other disciples. He was just entrusting, those 3, for whatever reasons he picked them, of like, you're going to have a little bit more leadership and, hopefully you'll help the others. And so I would suggest that's a good way of understanding God's favoritism. Now, there is one other way that I want to illustrate that Jesus completely changed the game in light of any type of perceived favoritism we might find in the Old Testament to the New Testament. And this might seem like a total curveball out of left field, but I'm gonna put a nice bow on this for us, okay?
Okay.
I want to talk about the weather. Does God control the weather? A lot of modern day doom and gloom preachers, every time there's an earthquake, every time there's a tsunami, it is, something happened. Literally, what was it? There was just some earthquake around the world, and I saw some preacher saying that's because of Sam Smith's Grammy appearance.
Oh, really?
And I'm like, oh my gosh. Like, okay. So even today, this exists within. It's not
like they gave him the Dove Award, right? This is the Grammys. This is the secular distortion.
Right. That would be an interesting twist.
Yeah.
To which, on a side note, and I didn't mean to get into this, but if you think Sam Smith dressing up like the caricature of the devil is evil incarnate. I'd like to show you the face of real evil, and it doesn't look like Sam Smith's Grammy performance. And there is real evil in our world. And if you're getting lost on that, I just want to encourage you. I think you're confused. But that's just that's bonus. That's a bonus. Free for everybody. Nice. Let me go back to the weather. The weather. What's the deal? Does God control the weather? Well, here's the fun fact. In the Old Testament, God does control the weather. And it's interesting how God controls the weather. Let me give you just two examples. There's more, but I picked two good ones. Leviticus 26, 3-5. God says this to the people of God. If you follow my decrees and are careful to obey my commands, notice the conditional language. If you do this and you do that, I will send you the seasonal rains. Okay, this is transactional God. If you listen to me, if you behave, I will give you rain. He goes on. The land will then yield its crops, and the trees of the field will produce their fruit. Your threshing season will overlap with the grape harvest, and your grape harvest will overlap with the season of planting grain. You will eat your fill and live securely in your own land. If you listen to me, I'm going to hook you up. The weather's going to be great. And again, if you're living in an agricultural society where you literally, it's life or death, whether or not you have a good growing season, this is a big deal for God to say, hey, you behave, you listen, I'm going to give you this. Deuteronomy doubles down on this. Deuteronomy 11, verses 13-17. If you carefully obey the commands I am giving you today, and if you love the Lord your God and serve him with all your heart and soul, okay, again, all these ifs, if you do all these things, then he will send the rains in their proper seasons, the early and the late rains, so you can bring in your harvests of grain, new wine, and olive oil. He will give you lush pasture land for your livestock, and you yourselves will have all you want to eat. But be careful. Now, Deuteronomy adds the negative as well. Don't let your heart be deceived, so that you turn away from the Lord your God, and you serve and worship other gods. If you do, so not only not, we started positive. You do the good things. If you do the bad things, the Lord's anger will burn against you. He will shut up the sky and hold back the rain, and the ground will fail to produce its harvest. Then you will quickly die in that good land the Lord is giving you. Now, this is, I think, pretty fascinating. That according to an ancient Near East Israelite understanding of God, God literally gave them rain or withheld the rain based on whether or not they were doing good, following God. So it is a very much, and I would say this is favoritism, because God is saying, if you're my chosen people, you do what I want, you will have better weather than the rest of the world. And, if I was another people group next door to the Israelites and I heard about this, I'd be like, well, what gives for us? Like we don't have a chance to, we're left out. These guys are going to get the best weather.
And depending if they got the rain, if the neighboring nations got some of the rain as well, or if it was just over Israel, that'd be a big
perfectly around Israel.
yeah, exactly.
Like no drops get onto anyone else. Okay, but here's and there's more examples of that. But here's the fascinating part. When you get to the New Testament and you get to Jesus, all bets are off. And one of the most brilliant and one of my favorite passages, Matthew chapter 5, verses 43-45, Jesus says this. You have heard the law that says, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. You could say that is morality in the Old Testament. Love the people that love you, hate the people who hate you, and most of us operate on this today. But then Jesus says this, but I say, love your enemies. Is there anything that would break favoritism more than that? Love your enemies. Okay, Jesus, that's weird. Nobody wants to love their enemies. Well, it gets more. Pray for those who persecute you. So when someone's actively doing something against you, pray for their good. Pray for God's favor to be upon them. In that way, if you actually do this, you will be acting as true children of your Father in heaven. This is what it means, Jesus says, to be part of this family, is we are the opposite of favoritism. And then check this out, Jeff. This part is incredible. And then Jesus says this next. For he gives his sunlight to both the evil and the good, and he sends rain on the just and the unjust alike. To which anyone who knew the Old Testament passages I read would say, no, God doesn't. That's not how God works. And here Jesus hijacks all of it. Jesus upends all of it. Jesus makes no room at all for favoritism. It's the anti-favoritism theology right here. You're going to love your enemies. You're going to pray for people who are actively working to harm you. You're going to pray for their good. And why do we do this? Because this is who God is. Because God gives sunlight to the good. God gives sunlight to the bad. God gives rain to the good. God gives rain to the bad. This is a beautiful demonstration of progressive revelation that we've talked about, that they thought this thing about God in the Old Testament, and then Jesus drops the hammer and goes, God isn't like that. God's like this. And if you understood this, there really is no favoritism in the sense that we often think of as favoritism. There is God wanting the thriving and the blessing of all people, and God will use people like us who are in the family to bring about this radical upside down type of kingdom.
Yeah. I mean, classic Jesus just saying, like, you basically wasted your time reading the Old Testament because none of it applies.
For the record, that was not the point I made.
It's no. It's like jazz, right? The notes that are disharmonious, that are out of key, that they make the tones all the richer, right? Something like that.
Okay, I can go with
that. I don't know. I mean, I know we've talked about this before. This is kind of like a classic thing about the Bible that you could either say is a strength or a weakness depending on your assumptions, right? The way that it kind of disagrees with itself and has multiple worldviews depending on the author.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But if we interpret it through Jesus, which is what I do, I think you have a killer way to answer your question and say, no, God doesn't actually show favoritism in the sense of the way we think of favoritism. Yes, God does pick people. God does bring people into unique situations. But ultimately, the heart of God is never to bless one person and not bless the other.
Yeah. And I suppose, would you say like the afterlife comes into play there as well? Because obviously some people have much better lives in this world than others, right? And some people
absolutely say that. And the fact that I believe God is going to redeem all people further speak to the point of there is no favoritism. So even if you didn't get to experience, what we would think of as a healthy relationship with God in this life, or if your life was filled with suffering, I think God absolutely makes that up to you in profound ways for all eternity. And that, again, if I didn't have that view, I would be more prone to want something like karma or some way of explaining, injustice today. But because I can say, no, I think this is who God is revealed to be, because this is who Jesus reveals God to be. Like, that's the heart of God. Like, literally gives the evil people sunshine and rain as well. Like, and if you're you're an ancient Israelite listening to this at that point, you'd be like, no, we get the sunlight. We get the rain. Like, that's one of our perks. And Jesus is like, no, that's not how God works.
I can see how it would be frustrating for other people, especially if they spent all this time, having the wrong worldview that was apparently like the revealed word of God. But, I mean, I understand the Jesus flips everything on its head interpretation of things. So that makes sense. That's a good answer.
Thank you.